Welcome to the second episode of the Pokémon Podcast. It's your boy Manny, and in today's episode, I wanted to just give a little shout out. Today is the day that the Indigo Disk DLC Part 2 for Pokémon Scarlet and Violet has been released. I've just basically come to the end of it and have an idea of what Pokemon I want to use in my new team or a potential team going into the new rule set, which is released on Christmas Day. It's a nice little gift by the Pokemon Company. But before we even jump in, something that I noticed in my journey was something that I touched on very briefly on the first episode, and that was around team building and being able to identify like a style and all these things. And it's a lot. It's a lot of information. What I said was really to find a team that you feel that comfortable with and something that you've seen that's been pretty successful and build off that. Because it's quite hard to start building the fundamentals or the building blocks to your own team. But I wanted to delve into that today because I made a really unique team and I did touch on it a little bit in the first episode, but I really want to dive into just the basics of team building and building a competitive team and things that I personally believe are very important, and based off discussions I've had with people and even just off the back of conversations in at tournaments as well. I've had a lot of back and forth, and people may not agree with all of my suggestions or opinions on how I think is best to build a team. But I think that having this as a fundamental basis, or like the building blocks moving forward, I think it helps with you asking for help as well as being someone who wants to create their own team. Because I think sometimes when we want to make a team, we have an idea already or an identity, and then we try to shoehorn in things just to make them fit, even if they may not fit that specific like domain or idea that you had in mind. And I just wanted to touch on that aspect of team building, as well as just having an understanding what the meta is, obviously type coverage and synergies that appear in the game, which is super important. So I want to jump into my team first and just explain my process of what I think is important for building a team. And then off the back of that, I want to go over some of the fundamentals as well. The so the first thing for me, I would say, is define how you wish to play. Is always the first thing. Forget any Pokemon whatsoever. I think you just put the Pokemon to the side for a second, and you decide how you wish to play. And for me, I always think about football. I'm a massive football fan. Haven't really watched football too much this year, but like always loved football. Always loved the strategy and the tactics around football. Been a massive fan of it for years. So for me, it's always they always say, "What's your style of football?" And I feel the same way in Pokemon. Is what's your style of playing Pokemon? And for me in this team, I decided my style is I will set up screens or have very bulky Pokemon which will be able to live and have a lot of longevity and be able to output a lot of damage. That was the idea of the team. So I've defined there how I wish to play. A lot of bulky Pokemon that can take a lot of hits and sponge hits and be able to dish out a lot of damage also. So that's the idea, and that's the theme of the team, which is defined. After you define the theme of the team, I think then you start selecting your Pokemon. Because I know a lot of people who they choose their Pokemon first, and I was like this as well. I chose my Pokemon first. Like, I want to use this, I want to use that, and as a result, I molded this really weird. It's like grabbing a bunch of ingredients, sticking it all into the frying pan, mixing it up, and then hoping for the best. And I think sometimes it works, and sometimes it tastes great, but sometimes it doesn't really end up being the way that you intended, or doesn't taste as great as it could have if you had a bit of structure around it and just an understanding of where the ingredients are best placed, whether you need something or if you don't need something. Because sometimes we feel like we need to add, when in some cases it might just be you need to subtract a couple things, and you might be able to make things work better by taking away. So I just want to raise that point as well, because I feel like even just in life in general, whenever we feel like doing something, we feel like we have to add to our plate rather than first thinking, assessing what we have, subtracting something that we might, which might free up that space to add that new thing. And I feel the same way about Pokemon. So, like I first said, the first important point is defining how you wish to play, and I did do that. And then the second thing is about selecting your Pokemon, which is the great part about it. I love it. Like, there's certain Pokemon you have an affinity towards, there's certain Pokemon that you really want to use, and a lot of people say, like, don't use your favorite Pokemon and use Pokemon that's really good. And I want to caveat that saying, I feel like there's a way that you can do both. I'll be honest, my favorite Pokemon is Aerodactyl. Aerodactyl is not in Pokemon Scarlet and Violet, so there's no way of me playing with my favorite Pokemon. But if you can identify a Pokemon that you feel like is relatively good in the current meta, which I'll talk about how we can identify the meta as well and what websites and resources to use, that is a good Pokemon that you like and you have a kind of attachment to in a sense and you want to use, then go for it. In this example, Regidrago was the Pokemon that I liked, and I thought, I'm going to make something work with this, with the theme of it being able to live for a very long time and dish out a lot of damage. So I've plopped in my first Pokemon, in this case Regidrago, and the spreads, I want you to ignore these numbers for a second. I even, to be honest, want you to ignore the item as well. I think the first place you want to start is you get your Pokemon down and you get potentially a move set going as well, just to get a couple of moves in. So in most cases, the moves are all of these things you see on the screen here, the moves, the items, these numbers, they're all quite malleable in the sense of they will change over time with your based on your theme. And I think having the right Pokemon in your team will help facilitate the process of where these numbers need to go, what item is being used, and what moves you potentially are using in some cases as well. So this set is very, very unique, and I want to make that very clear, because the thing is with teams in general, you'll find, and Pokemon in general, you'll find like very standard or most used ways of using a Pokemon, which is great, and I love it because it gives you an understanding of what's being used by most people and why it's most common, and you can see that, and it does give you an understanding and a bearing of what highlighting popular strategies really around this Pokemon. And that is important, that is useful, but if we go back to the theme being living for a long time and dishing out damage, the second thing that comes to mind for me is being able to set up screens, which in the game is like reflect and light screen. So Grimmsnarl is predominantly the Pokemon that is utilized in this role of screens, and I will talk about roles in more detail later and principles that I believe that are quite important when building a team. But like I said, this is going to be the role of someone putting up screens. In this case, it's Grimmsnarl. Perfect. So that's already, we have two Pokemon down, which is a Dragon type and a Fairy type. And then this is where you get into the idea of having a core. And a core just means Pokemon that work well together. And usually that's off the basis of their Pokemon typing. So for example, a Dragon type is super effective against dragons, and it's very weak to fairies, because fairies are immune to dragon type moves. So if that's the case, you'd want a Pokemon that covers for those weaknesses. And in our case, the main cause that you see is like the starters in the game, where you have Squirtle, Bulbasaur, and Squirtle, Bulbasaur, and Charmander. Whereby you have fire, water, grass, because it's like a triangle where fire beats grass, but grass beats water, and water beats fire. And this is the same way how it works for a team, where a fairy beats dragon, dragon doesn't beat fairy, but steel beats fairy, and then it's a bit of a weird triangle in this case, because obviously dragon doesn't actually beat steel, but fundamentally those three typings work really well, because they can prevent or resist the damage output from those respective types if you start swapping in. So in our case, we had the dragon type, we have the fairy type, so we jump into the steel type, which is then Heatran, which goes back to the theme of dishing out a lot of damage, staying for a long time, because there's a lot of steel types in the game, and I just want to, I should have this saved, but I'll just copy and paste it. But you might choose your favorite Pokemon, and then you might be like, okay, so I've got some Steel types, sort by BST. That's the way that I usually do it. And you might see, like, for example, I could easily have chosen King Gambit, Hisui, Gudra, Goldengo, Iron Treads. Some people use it, not a lot of people use it, to be fair. But very common Pokemon that you see is usually King Gambit, Heatran, and Gudra. And that's one way of identifying, okay, if these Pokemon fulfill that role. So you might put on the back burner what Pokemon you want to choose, but I think it's always great to just put something in, and then you can change the Pokemon afterwards as well if you really feel the need to. And that comes from playtesting also. It's a process. We just want at the very start is define how you play, select those core Pokemon, and then reverse engineer those roles that I'm about to mention as well. So when we talk about roles, for me, I believe that there's core principles for a Pokemon team. We obviously mentioned how you wish to play the game. I think that's important. You want to enjoy, you want to do well, you want to compete. I'm a competitor. I want to do well. I want to use the Pokemon I like in most cases if I'm able to, and you want to be able to have a core of Pokemon which fundamentally work well together, and then there's going to be principles of a team. So the principles of a team, I think there's certain Pokemon that have to fulfill a certain role. One is redirection. Two is intimidate. I think intimidate is basically has to be on a team in my opinion. And speed control is the third principle. There's optional principles that I've put which are borderline like needed in a sense. One is one way to stop priority moves, and another one is terrain, and that's off the back of a conversation I had with a friend of mine who was actually streaming, and we did actually verse each other. So in the future, I'm happy. I really want to get guests on as well. So I'm pretty sure I'll be able to try and get him on, and also do some reviews of battles that I've had the privilege of recording, and also people recording the battles I had with them and going over that as a different podcast episode. But going back to those teams, to those the principles of the team, you have one redirection Pokemon, one intimidate Pokemon, and one speed control Pokemon. So if we go back to, if you're looking at my team right here, we have one redirection Pokemon. In our case, it's Amoonguss because it has Rage Powder. One intimidate Pokemon being Landorus. And I'm breaking my own principles here because there's not actually a Pokemon on this team per se that is used for speed control. The Indeedee does not have Trick Room. And no Pokemon on this team can learn like Tailwind. The only form of speed control I can say that I have is using Thunder Wave, which is 90% accurate, so it has a chance to miss. So it's a very inconsistent way of doing it. And going back to those optional, borderline needed types of role principles that I've also established is one way to stop priority moves. It's a big issue, like extreme speed, fake out, all these moves which they offset the need for a Pokemon to be fast because they'll always move first. Or move first in most cases. So to prevent that, I put Indeedee in my team with Psychic Surge, which means that Psychic Terrain, which is being set, prevents any priority moves being used on Pokemon which are non-flying. So this would apply to everyone on my team besides Landorus. Landorus would still be hit by priority moves. But off the back of having someone that stops priority moves, I also have someone that covers that one terrain Pokemon also being the Indeedee because Rillaboom is quite common in the meta at the moment. And that's the core principle of a Pokemon team. I think you should always have one redirection Pokemon, one intimidating Pokemon, one speed control, and then, like I said, those optional one being priority moves being stopped or terrain. So another example of something that stops priority move is Farigiraf. Farigiraf has the ability Armor Tail, which prevents priority moves being used on your partner and yourself. So that's just another way, instead of having the terrain, I could have also put in a Farigiraf. But once you have established like the Pokemon that you wish to use, the theme of the team, the Pokemon that fulfill that core, and then off the back of those principles I mentioned, having those Pokemon being fit in our case being Amoonguss, Landorus, and then for the priority being Indeedee, that builds out the team. And you might have a team of 6, and you might sit there and think to yourself, the team of six, I don't really like know what I know what role they fulfill, but does that mean how am I gonna play these Pokemon? Because there's Pokemon that can redirect, which are very strong, and off the back of a conversation I had in Dansk when I went to that regional, I actually changed this team for the side event the day after with the advice I got from my friends, and I think like I said in episode one, very powerful thing to be able to meet people at the events and have these kind of discussions, because the way that I was thinking was when you see there's like a more advanced strategies in the game. There's things that you want to play know that are going to happen, and you want to try and mitigate the effectiveness of those teams. So an example is Trick Room, which is basically inverts the speed where the slowest Pokemon goes first, rather than the fastest Pokemon, which is the usual in Pokemon. And then also things like weather and terrain effects. I haven't accounted for weather in this case, but terrain effects in the context of a Rillaboom has Grassy Surge, which then stops the psychic terrain, which prevents a priority move. So there's things that get a little bit more advanced when you start playing and play testing with the team. And this is an iterative process. I want to make that very clear. It's not just you make a team, you're done, and that's it. It's more time you're going to be spending looking at the team, making adjustments, and making things fit the theme that I mentioned. And I want to make this very clear. It's a very fluid process. It's not something that you have to be very rigid about. A team is only as good as the individual, in the sense of you'll get better using your team over time, but there'll always be weaknesses with a team. There is no perfect team. I'm not aware of a team that is very perfect. I'm aware of a team that does really well against me, but I'm not aware of a team that is a perfectly synergized team where it cannot be beat, cannot be defeated. So like I think the best thing to do is also get rid of that idea of perfection, especially when it comes to playing the game, because it's very difficult to define the perfect team. I think you can make a perfect team in the context of how you play the game, but it's also down to your decision making. And the first part about your decision making is tested when making a team, and I think that's you want to build that skill set. Your decision making when building a team, also off the back of that, will help you with your decision making when playing against other teams with a team that you've created, because you know how things will work. And that makes me jump to something that I want to talk about, which is also the damage calculator. I did show this in the first episode also, but and in this example, just a random example, I've got a Hydrapple and I've got a Landorus. So Hydrapple is a new Pokemon that's come out in in the DLC, as a Pokemon I'm potentially thinking of using. And this is what I do sometimes. I choose a Pokemon I want to use. I haven't even put any EVs. I've got like 148 in special defense just randomly and stuck in an assault vest. But the point is that I bring a Pokemon I'd like to use and I run some calculations. So if I didn't touch this Pokemon at all, a Hydro Pump instantly kills this Landorus. And this is the beauty of making a team, where you can mess around with the numbers. So once you have your Pokemon, you can start using these numbers, these effort values, to influence the damage output of different Pokemon. So the Landorus is a especially offensive Landorus. So if I increase the number here, you can see that these numbers start going lower. So this has gone from, this is 25.9. If I just increase it a little bit more, you see it's gone down to 24.8, and the range has been lowered. So there's going to be times where the calculator and you just building off the back of just having that experience of building your team and building it a certain way, you can make it counter some of the more frustrating Pokemon or more common Pokemon, in the sense that you'll see within the meta. So the damage calculator is a great tool to be used when you create your team, because it goes back to where I said that once you choose your 6 or have a 6, you then start looking at those numbers, looking at the move sets you're going to use, looking at the items you might use. So in this example, I've got an assault vest, and then I have 200 investment into special defense, which means that even after a sludge bomb, it is a guaranteed 2-hit KO, but I can dish out enough damage where a Hydro Pump, if I did land, and that's another thing about moves missing, is also a big issue in the game. But if you did land that move, then you're plain sailing, because you're obviously going to be removing that Pokemon from the field after that turn. And then I think another thing to do with the team, and if you're talking about synergy, because we have the game mechanic of terrestrialization, which means that a Pokemon is actually able to change what type it is. And a good resource that I've been using is the Mariland Team Builder. So you can input like different Pokemon. So let's say if we just go back to the Regidrago, Heatran, and a Grimmsnarl core, you can see here. So the best way to identify those typings and this core that you make for your team that covers those weaknesses. So you'll see right now it says you have a 2x Dragon weakness and a 2x Fairy weakness, as well as a 2x Ice weakness. And if you input another Pokemon, so in our case, Grimmsnarl is a unique case because it's also weak to Fairy type moves. So it's obviously then increased that counter by 2. But we've also then increased the counter for resistances by 1. And you also see the same for different types, because it's a Dark type. It obviously is immune to Psychic type moves, and then it's resist Ghost type moves. But this is how I build my team. I put a Pokemon in, put another Pokemon in, and then you start seeing that, okay, if I put a Heatran in now next, Heatran covers that Dragon type weakness once again, and then it also covers that 1 resistance for Fairy, and you can start seeing how your team comes together. It might not necessarily tell you, okay, Heatran's going to be my really offensive Pokemon, Grimmsnarl is going to be my really defensive Pokemon, but it gives you an understanding of what you're weak to, what your resistances are. And then if you go to websites like Pikalytics, you can see the common and the meta in a sense. You can see that Iron Hands is very common, Fluttermane is very common, Landorus is very common, and then all these other Pokemon. So you can see that 50% of Pokemon on Pokemon Showdown, the battle simulator, use Fluttermane. So every 2 games you're going to see this Pokemon, which is kind of crazy to be honest. But the point is, you want to have an understanding of that, and if you know that these Pokemon are very common, you want to curate a team which can also account for these Pokemon, because if these are going to be seen all the time, you want a team that can adjust to that and be able to play against those Pokemon. Iron Hands does a lot of damage to a Heatran and even potentially a Grimmsnarl in a sense, just based off the moveset it has available to it. But at the same time, a Heatran is really great into a Fluttermane. And then to cover like certain Pokemon, you bring someone in. So like a Landorus is a very good example of something that's good against an Iron Hands, because it's a fighting electric type, and this is a flying ground type, so it's immune to the electric type moves, and it resists the fighting type moves, which you can quite clearly see here, where we've now got resistance to fighting, and then we have an immunity to electric type moves. And that's how you start building the team, because you have an understanding of how the types work together. And like I said, these are the principles can be broken. I just think of those principles of intimidate, redirection, speed control, because it's quite easy to make a team understanding those principles, and then off the back of that you can start building out the complete roster of your team as well, because you're more than likely going to need redirection in a doubles format, because even though you can protect with 1 Pokemon, you can't protect across multiple turns, or the percentage of landing a protect across multiple turns consecutively reduces by like 1. I think it's 1 divided by n plus 1, or 1 divided by n times 2, or something to that effect, where it continues to be like a 1 hot. It's 100% for the first turn. Second turn it's half. The third turn I think it might even be a quarter, probably even an eighth. So its redirection is quite important to try and reduce or mitigate the damage done to those Pokemon that are going to be those heavy hitters when you're in a really precarious situation. And off the back of just using this team builder, something that you can even go more advanced, and if you're feeling a bit more comfortable, you obviously understand that Terra types are going to be a part of your game as well, because sometimes your coverage for my coverage for Regidrago against fairy types just might be that I Terra into steel, and I resist the fairy type moves. And in this team builder, the really great thing about it is actually that you can allow for Terra types. So if I go here and I've really allowed the wrong thing. If I go here and I go to Terra types, it says here custom Terra. So if I do Regidrago and I go steel, you can now see that it's accounted for that, and it's got Regidrago instead of it being taking damage and ×2, it's now gone down to a half. And in this example, the Grimmsnarl was Ghost, which then has an impact on your overall defensive coverage of your team. So this tool is really, really useful when building a team because it gives you that understanding of the typings and the coverage that you have on your team. So I'd highly recommend that if you're really, really struggling and you're like, I don't really know what my core is, I kind of just want to use. So in my example, I wanted to just use a Regidrago. I can take a look at this and think to myself, fairy types, dragon types, ice types. What's the best Pokemon for this? And first thing I might think about is going to steel type Pokemon. So then that takes us back here. And then if I just write down steel, I can just filter by steel and then choose a Pokemon here. And then go back to the Marilyn team builder and be like, okay, in this case I want to choose King Gambit. Put King Gambit in, and then you can see where more weaknesses have now been more apparent or have appeared off the back of that one Pokemon being added to your team. And this is why I use this a lot. I use this basically every time I build a team. I'm just waiting because obviously the DLC's just come out and it's very, very different. And being someone who with the background of a computer scientist, like being able to develop like something really quickly where you can add those new Pokemon that have been put into the game is quite a long process. So I respect that and just have to kind of wait for that to come into play. But when that does, I'm going to be adding like certain Pokemon that are in the game now which weren't in the game previously. So like for example, if Iron Crown has been added because we were aware of it before, but Pokemon like this that are just joined based of the Indigo Disk DLC, you can see how they fare up in their typings and also what kind of idea you might have around what Terra type that they'll be using. So I think for me that's the important thing where if you start building your own team, you start having a great understanding of how to use your team, which is one part. What changes you need to make to the team, because when you use someone else's team, I think it's quite easy just to go autopilot, use that team the way that it was used in the tournament and just try and churn out wins and just playtest. But also in team building, a core component of that is playing with your team, but then you would have to make adjustments. And when you don't have a true understanding of someone's team, because someone's created a team off the back of the information that they had provided, it's sometimes you can get a team report which is quite useful to read. So if you ever see a team report, it just gives you some of those calculations that I mentioned about in the damage calc. A team report basically tells you this is how you might lead your team, this is how you might lead the team against certain teams or matchups. So we, like I said, Fluttermane's 50%, Landorus 50%, Iron Hands is around 46%, so it's just around 50. Let's just say for argument's sake, if you know where those Pokemon are going to be cropping up a lot in matches, the team report might say if you see a or Iron Hands and a Landorus, this is how you lead the team, which is a great way to get into understanding what the team does. But when you really take the time to build the team yourself, I feel like you think of things very differently, because the perception that we have of certain Pokemon is influenced by the meta, which is one aspect of it, but also how you wish to play the Pokemon. Like going back to the Regidrago set, I put scope lens on and focus energy, and this is, some people say that the focus energy scope lens thing was seen before, and it definitely has been from Hydreigon in a different regulation much earlier in the career of Pokemon Scarlet and Violet, or when it first came out. But I haven't seen many focus energy Regidragos, and I wanted to take advantage of that because I thought to myself, as much as we don't see Dondozo, if Dondozo has two if Dondozo has two like stat increases in every stat, I have no way of beating that Pokemon. Yes, I might be able to live a lot more of the hits because of the reflect or the light screen, but I don't really have a way of dealing with that. So I thought to myself, you know what? I'm just gonna try a Focus Energy Regidrago set. Focus Energy Regidrago. If we just go to the damage calculator, I might actually have the set in this, and I happen to have it. Without a Focus Energy, my set does KO the Landorus, but let's just say we're versing an Iron Hands. And you see that Draco Meteor does 49.5%, but also at the same time, Iron Hands doesn't really do too much. It's a guaranteed free hit KO against the set I have because I'm very defensive, but I have some investment in special attack to be able to do some damage. But let's just say we had the Focus Energy up, and I used Draco Meteor with a crit, and because Focus Energy plus Scope Lens is guaranteed crits, I'm landing a move that is now a guaranteed two hit KO, and it's just having that awareness of, yes, it's a bit off the wall, very anti meta, very different, but by doing something like this, I've used the Pokemon in a different way as it would be used usually, but it fits a purpose on the team and the theme around what the team was, to live for a long amount of time and dish out a lot of damage. It fulfills that very clearly, and that's why I always like to go back to the beginning where I said define how you wish to play, because how you wish to play will help narrow the scope and constrain yourself to which Pokemon you might end up using, and off the back of that, then you can start building a team in the vision of where you see it will best excel. And like I didn't think to myself that this would be the best way to use the Pokemon initially. When I saw Regidrago, even if you put it into the calculator, it's really good in that sense where it gives you sets which are quite common. So there's a Dragon Fang set, which and you can see this does 63.9% on the Dragon Fang. This is without any critical hits, but that does a lot of damage. And then you can also, if you go to and you can still see that you live, or it's a free hit KO, guaranteed free KO. And then you can also then go to a different set, which is the Choice Scarf set, and you see that this does a little bit less damage in the sense of it's only doing 48.6%. But then you then notice there's a 60% chance nearly to hit KO you with Drain Punch. And it's just by understanding the vision of the team, you have the accessibility and the flexibility to start molding the Pokemon in the way that you intend to use them. And you might intend to use them the way that that is very popular, and you can see quite clearly in this damage calculator that this Choice Scarf set, very popular set, hence is there. But you might think to yourself, this doesn't work for my use case, so I'm going to make a few changes. Maybe I take a few points off of speed and I increase my defense. So instead of it being a 60% chance to be 2 KO'd, it's now a 17.6% chance. And that's the great thing about the game. It's very malleable, like I said, and you have a lot of opportunity to make those changes. And that's why I'm quite proud of this team, because this is a team that I created myself. The moves, the spreads themselves weren't necessarily created myself. I took this from the team builder, from the damage calculator, I apologize. Same with this Indeedee, and even the same with this Amoonguss. And I think I made a couple alterations with this Landorus, but this is still quite a common thing to see because the speed investment outspeeds, I believe, an Iron Bundle without any speed investment. But all of these like terms and all of these things that I've identified is all from the calculator. You can see the speed stat, you can see the attack stat, you can see the defense stat, you can see how much of an impact your Pokemon are making in the mathematical sense. So I always say that if you have that vision, you have that understanding of those principles and put those Pokemon in, and then you get to choose a Pokemon, in my case, that I quite like out of the ones I wanted to see, which is still relatively good. It's not like it's not a good Pokemon. Regidrago is a very respectable Pokemon and very, very good Pokemon, in fact. But it's not like and there's obviously going to be people on the other side of the pond where they decide that they just want to go to tournaments and play with Pokemon that they like, and Their Pokemon might not be very strong, but it might just be really fun and cool just to see how they interact with the game. And that's the completely different mindset to what I personally have. But I just want to make that very clear as well, that if you wish to play the game a certain way, I think these are the kind of questions you need to potentially start asking yourself as you start going into playing the game competitively. And these are questions that I've asked myself, and off the back of asking those questions to myself and building a team, I can then articulate myself and explain to other people who ask for certain things about my team, like why did I make this decision? It's like designing a product or a solution. You come up with your own innovative ideas off the back of things that you've seen work or not work, and then when you have other people's input, you might decide that someone says, let's say you're making like an Amazon, and you have a website, and they're like, I really like it, but I don't like the color scheme. And you might be like really a fan of the color scheme, and they might say to you, if you change the color scheme, I think more people would interact with it because it appears better and it just seems more seamless of an experience. And I think it's the same thing with Pokemon. People will talk to you about your team, and they might say, and the great thing about, like I said, having those people that you can communicate with, whether it's on Discord, whether it's in person, they saw my team and we spoke about it, and they said, look, it fits effectively. It does fit the theme in the sense of you have something that is going to last a long time, but also dish out a lot of damage. But it's way too defensive. You've got 3 Pokemon which effectively don't have any damage output, and if you had to bring all 3, you only have 1 Pokemon, so which is 25% of your team initiating damage to your opponent. And off the back of that, if we just go back slightly, there is, I believe it's called the MSS. Here it is. The Dansk MSS. So there's a side event that happens on the day after. So the Saturday is the main event for the regional, and then there's a side event which is just a best of one, but it's in the same rule set. And instead, I got told, swap out the Amoonguss and use an Ogerpon. So then I used an Ogerpon, and I decided to use an Ogerpon Wellspring because it goes back to that having that trifecta of having a fire type, a water type, and a grass type, and that covered that by using the Ogerpon Wellspring. And going back to the principles, it has Follow Me, which is the foe's move target the user, which the move was used on. And if I use Follow Me, that is a redirection. That is a sense of redirection. That is part of those principles. That the Moongus fulfilled that principle of being a redirector, and so does the Ogerpon. Yes, it's more offensive and it applies a lot more pressure, as you can see that it's got a base 120 attack and it has a very respectable 110 speed. So it's one of those things where you start, this is how you iterate. You communicate with other people, you discuss, or you might even identify. When I was playtesting, I used the Amoonguss because for me, when I was playtesting, I saw a lot of Trick Room teams, and as a result of that, Amoonguss fulfilled a better purpose than I thought the Ogerpon would. After going to a tournament, your experience is quite different because the things that you might see online versus what you see in real life can always vary and differ. But that's the great thing about it. You just readjust, and off the back of those conversations, off just discussing, this is the idea of the team, this is how I envisioned it, got the suggestion saying use Ogerpon Wellspring, played with this team, used this set because they actually gave me the set with me being a bit funny with the HP and defense for some weird reason. I don't know why. There was a reason behind the madness, but I cannot remember, so I do apologize. But the point is, I went to the MSS, which is just a mid-season showdown, the day after, and I finished 23rd. And I think if I won one of those games, I can't predict this obviously, because if you win, you obviously then verse people who are of the same win-loss ratio as yourself in most cases. So I can't say if I won I would have got top 8, but the 2 people I lost to were in top 8, and then I lost one game off a really good play by my opponent. But if I did win that 3rd game, I would have had a record of 6-2 rather than 5-3, and I might have seen myself finish even higher. And that's just off the back of one Pokemon change. And I'm not gonna say that like it was the be or end all, but it's still something that had a significant impact on my results. I may have played slightly differently because obviously I saw what people were doing the day before, and people's teams are obviously going to be different. But the point is that you can see the impact of just swapping out a single Pokemon and how great of an impact it can have on your team. And I think that's why when it comes to team building, you have to be fluid. You have to be able to be dynamic and say, this worked and this doesn't work, so I have to make that change. And it is quite difficult because I was really proud of being like, okay, this is my team. I made it. Yes, not every EV spread was mine, but I made it in the sense of this Regidrago set. It belongs, not it effectively belongs to me, but it is kind of the kind of way I wanted to play. It identifies the kind of person or like a vision I had for my team, and it worked really well. But sometimes you got to detach from that and be like, Amoongus, you did a great job against Trick Room, but we have to pull you out, buddy, and we need to bring someone else in to dish out some more damage. And it's just being able to have that humility to listen to others, and sometimes humility to look at your own results and reflect and be introspective and be like, this is not working, so I'm going to slightly readjust and we'll see what happens. And if readjusting makes it even worse, then we can go back to square one, and then we can make another adjustment, or we can potentially even change the EV spread of the Pokemon or the moveset of the Pokemon. And these are just things to think about. I know I've spoken at length about a lot of different things which sound like a lot of moving parts, and I just wanted you guys just to hear my perspective on team building. And like I said, I am going to be having guests on the show as well, and that's something that I'll be doing in the near future. So a discussion like this, I would love to have a back and forth with someone about, because I did have it in a Twitch chat, and it was a really good back and forth. And I'm going to actually link that stream as well, because that was really great to just have that discussion with someone about the game and also my understanding of it, because you want your ideas to be challenged constantly so you can innovate. And I think that's the great thing about the game. It's very innovative. A lot of people do a lot of different things, and to great success. And I can envision you, the listener, or even someone who's watching, that you can get better at the game and you can make that difference if you constantly challenge your ideas, and that applies to everything in life. And if you did enjoy, this is me, Manny. I've just started the podcast. I haven't got a name for it, so would love to hear a suggestion about the name for this podcast. I will probably put a poll in the Spotify. If not, it will also be uploaded on YouTube. So feel free to put a YouTube comment down. And I hope you guys enjoyed this podcast episode and took a lot from it. And I can't wait to hear what kind of... Tell me what Pokemon you actually want to use in from this DLC. There's quite a few that I would love to hear what you're thinking, and what teams you might build around certain Pokemon. So I'd love to hear that. Thank you so much, and this is me signing off.